After days on the razor's edge, Ukraine is now a nation at war. Just hours ago, Russian forces began their attack. President Vladimir Putin warning other countries that any attempt to interfere with the Russian action will lead to, quote, consequences they have never seen.
What with one thing and another, President Vladimir Putin of Russia must be considered a long shot for the Nobel Prize for Peace. He has nevertheless this week pitched himself as a great reconciler. On a state visit to one of the few countries still willing to kick the red carpet in the direction of his aeroplane, specifically Azerbaijan, Putin declared that he would be delighted to facilitate the signing of a peace treaty between Azerbaijan and its neighbour Armenia, two countries frequently at odds.
I emphasize that Russia will continue to contribute in every interaction and the conclusion of a peace treaty on the basis of the well-known trilateral agreements reached by the presidents of Russia, Azerbaijan and the Prime Minister of Armenia in 2022.
Alert listeners will have spotted the cue there for a potted history lesson, compressing the last century and change of ferocious rancour into a couple of hundred words or so before we return to the present day. Strap yourselves in, and we'll be needing some peering through time's swirling mists music. The first conflict between Azerbaijan and Armenia as we now recognise them occurred in 1918. Both countries declared independence on May 28th that year, bolting from Russia's collapsing empire as attention in the far-off power centres of Moscow and St. Petersburg was consumed by revolution and civil war. Not for the last time, however, there was disagreement over where one country stopped and the other began. Both contributing to and exacerbating all of this were some of the fundamental schisms that beset the Caucasus as grimly as they do, for example, the Balkans. Azerbaijanis are mostly Muslims, Armenians mostly Christians. Azerbaijan's language is officially written in the Latin alphabet, Armenia's in a very pretty one of their own invention. There is, doubtless, also an interminable simmering row over ownership of a particular local comestible that both sides insist they cooked first. Fighting in these inaugural hostilities continued for 2 years until the Red Army descended and made everyone's mind up for them. Azerbaijan and Armenia were both incorporated into the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. Things remained reasonably, if resentfully, quiet until the late 80s to early 90s when, once again, a Russian hegemon unravelled, Azerbaijan and Armenia both concluded that nobody was watching the door, but discovered as they made their break that they still disagreed over whom should govern what. At particular issue was Nagorno-Karabakh, a largely ethnically Armenian mountain enclave contained within Azerbaijan, which wanted to formally join Armenia. A long war sputtered throughout the early 90s. Shorter ones were fought in 2016 and 2020, and late last year an Azerbaijani offensive conclusively retook the territory. Perhaps 150,000 ethnic Armenians, pretty much all of Nagorno-Karabakh's population, fled for their lives.
Let's take a look at the self-proclaimed Republic of Nagorno-Karabakh. It has ceased to exist as of January 1st. About 100,000 people fled, and the self-styled republic's leaders signed an agreement to dissolve Nagorno-Karabakh in 2024.
There have been sporadic ructions since. At least 4 times in the last week alone there have been exchanges of fire between Armenian and Azerbaijani border positions. Within Armenia, there have been rowdy protests over the decision of Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan to return a few border villages to Azerbaijan in the interests of forestalling further future conflict by removing possible reasons for it.
This is a shame of our nation that our government, with the face of Nikol Pashinyan, is not taking all the required measures to save Armenians wherever they should be.
But no treaty has been signed by Azerbaijan and Armenia. Pashinyan has spoken of his fears that Azerbaijan may yet seek to press its advantage into the territory of Armenia proper, which Azerbaijan's president, Ilham Aliyev, has rather tactlessly referred to as Western Azerbaijan.
This intention can be read in all statements and actions of Azerbaijan.
One possible flashpoint seemed the actual Western Azerbaijan, i.e. the chunk of Azerbaijan's territory which is situated on the other side of Armenia. Azerbaijan had said it wanted a railroad and/or road corridor to this exclave and didn't want it operated, patrolled, guarded or governed by Armenia. However, in recent bilateral talks between Baku and Yerevan, Azerbaijan has dropped this, at least for the moment, possibly hoping by way of return that Armenia will ditch its constitutional claim to Nagorno-Karabakh. Progress seems to be, maybe, proceeding? The question thus arises of why Vladimir Putin is seeking to insert and/or assert himself where a potential peace treaty is concerned, especially when there would appear to be another conflict he could more usefully apply himself to ending, especially since Ukraine began helping itself to chunks of Russian territory to see how he likes it. As of this broadcast, Ukraine's forward positions in Kursk Oblast are only about 600 kilometers further from the gates of Moscow than Napoleon got, and the Ukrainians have faster vehicles. The answer is unlikely to be a heartening one for Armenian listeners in particular. Putin still sees the Caucasus, as he sees all former Soviet territories, as Russia's sphere of influence at best, temporarily rogue provinces at worst. He doesn't want them any further away strategically and politically than they are geographically. And in recent times, Armenia has been increasingly unsubtle in its wistful inclination towards the West, not least because it believes, correctly, that Russia's alleged peacekeepers stationed in Nagorno-Karabakh were less than no help as Azerbaijan stormed the territory last September. Armenia recently has withdrawn from Russia's approximate NATO analogue, the Collective Security Treaty Organization, held military exercises with the United States, bought artillery from France, and Prime Minister Pashinyan has encouraged his fellow citizens to discuss the prospect of one day applying for membership of the European Union. Putin has suggested that Russian troops could perhaps guard the corridor linking Azerbaijan's two halves. The encouraging news there is that Azerbaijan seems as unenthused by this idea as Armenia, and Armenia surely understands that at any table Putin might set for the two Caucasian neighbours, the thumbscrews and/or the trapdoor into the shark tank will be at the Armenian end. For Monocle Radio, I'm Andrew Mueller.